Playing games in VR is fun. Just being in the game world and having your hands tracked by motion controllers, aiming and shooting guns naturally, or picking up and manipulating objects is a game-changing experience compared to playing a game on a normal monitor or TV. But as we spend more time in VR, that novelty does wear off, and the truth is that most games, VR or non-VR, are average. Most things are average. Most of us have got average lives. We're average looking, living in an average house, driving an average car, going on average holidays with a disappointingly average wife or husband. In gaming terms, an average game is okay. It isn't good, it isn't bad, it's just okay. It's like a 6 or 7 out of 10. I don't personally think that every VR game needs to reinvent the wheel. Some of my favourite games I've played in VR are VR ports or mods, like Resident Evil 2, Half-Life 2, Portal 2, Left 4 Dead 2, other games that end in 2. Some of these games have got very basic motion control support, and whilst the mods are great, the reason they're so good in VR is because they're excellent games out of VR. If you take a great game, you make it playable in VR, guess what? It's still a great game. After playing some games with the Unreal Injector, I've also realised that an average non-VR game is still an average game in VR. I do think a more native feeling VR game can elevate itself just through the extra interactivity it adds over the traditional game. But if you're a developer looking to make a VR game, then chances are that you don't have a large budget, so making a game on such a tight budget that can live up to a regular non-VR release is unrealistic. If you want to make a great VR game, you need to lean into VR as a medium to offer something more than what a regular non-VR game can. The big AAA developers can get away with average gameplay because they dazzle us with graphics, huge worlds and lots of skill trees. If you're a small indie developer, it's important to know your limits and work around a core gameplay mechanic. Game development starts with an idea. Generally, you'll have a type of game or genre that you want to make. It's important for developers to make a game that they want to play themselves. Trying to guess what people want is a bad idea. Once you know the type of game that you want to make, then you need to figure out your primary gameplay loop. These are the things that you'll be doing on a moment-to-moment basis. Having a strong, focused primary gameplay loop is essential to make a good VR game. Here are some examples. If you're making a puzzle game, then a standout title would be Portal and Portal 2. The concept is simple. You shoot out a portal into a wall, you shoot out another portal somewhere else, and now you can walk through the portal and instantly teleport yourself between two locations. The actual act of firing the portals is very easy. The complexity is added through clever level design, and as you progress, they slowly introduce more and more complex levels. Like in Portal 2, they add new elements like jump pads and different liquids that allow you to jump higher or run faster. But the gameplay loop never changes. You don't really get any other tools, you mostly use the portal gun and fire 2 portals throughout the entire game. Another great example, but one that's made for VR, is Shadow Point. This is my favourite VR puzzle game, and just like Portal, it's got a very simple primary gameplay loop. The object of the game is to pick up or manipulate an object into a light source to create a shadow that matches the shape on a wall. It fits perfectly well with VR, as you have to manoeuvre 3D objects through a 3D space with your hands. The concept never changes. They add complexity through level design, but also introducing new gameplay mechanics, like a magnifying glass that will change the shape of an object. They have levels with mirrors, but you have to pass things to your reflection. You then having to line the shadows in the mirror version of the world. You've got portals that can change gravity, and in later levels they flip things around. So rather than you putting objects in front of light sources, you have to move the light source around to create the shadow. It's a fantastic puzzle game that is expertly paced, introducing new things to keep you hooked, whilst also never straying from the core concept of creating shadows. What about other genres though? Well, first-person shooters are the most popular. Holding and shooting some sort of weapon would be the primary gameplay loop, but that in itself isn't enough. If it was, then we'd all still be enjoying wave shooters. Shooters can be a lot more complex, but one way you can iterate on the basic shooting mechanics is through traversal. A couple of recent games are built around how you move around the world, with Stride Fates and The Burst giving the player the ability to jump, slide, wall run, climb and even grapple around the environments. The gunplay itself is basic. You have the usual pistol or submachine gun, but being able to run around, sliding on the floor while shooting an enemy feels fun. The Burst have also taken the grappling concept and not only used it to swing from platform to platform, but you also use it to grab objects from a distance. This can include things like explosive barrels that you can pull onto enemies. There are times that you need to use the grapple to get past blockages by pulling away rubble or opening doors. Both of these games are fun to play because of the combination of the movement and the shooting. Another thing that you can do to make VR shooters more fun is by making weapons themselves more interesting to use. Most VR shooters use real life weapons. you'll have a pistol, submachine gun, some sort of assault rifle, or maybe a shotgun. Other than the shotgun, which is more built for short range, they all do the same thing really. The difference is just how fast they fire and how many bullets it takes to kill an enemy. I've made a separate video just on this topic, but I'm a big believer in having VR specific guns. Guns that are made around VR and motion controls to introduce more satisfying gun mechanics. A great example of this would be Vertigo 2, a fantastic game that's got loads of VR specific weapons not based on real life guns. For example, they have a pistol with a test tube type of ammo, which has got liquid inside. You reload it by popping out the old one, then you slide the new one in, and the clear container makes it very easy to see how much ammo you have left. They've got a revolver that reloads by splitting open, the clip will pop out, you pop in a new one, and then flick the wrist to close it. It doesn't take long to get into a flow with this gun, quickly reloading it, and it always feels fun because of the way that you have to move your hand to close it. This is my personal favourite weapon in the game. You've got some weapons with alternate fire modes that you can switch between by flicking a switch on the side. Another one of my favourites is a type of rocket launcher, but instead of rockets, it fires spikes that will stick into enemies and stick them into walls. They have an organic weapon that you reload by feeding it balls, which then get fired out and explode. It's just a great example of taking the first person shooter and focusing on designing weapons that aren't just point and shoot. The added interactivity and the way each weapon feels different, as well as serving a different purpose, makes them feel special and fun to use. Another game that I've been playing recently that's got an incredibly fun and addictive gameplay loop is Ancient Dungeon. This game looks like shit. It really put me off playing it, but after a multiplayer update, I ended up giving it a go because I didn't want to be left out when my mates were playing it. The actual gameplay is really simple. You actually only have one loadout from the majority of the game. You've got a sword in one hand, and you also throw a dagger which acts as a ranged weapon. You also get a crossbow loadout later in the game, but the game doesn't really have a lot of weapons or variety. You can pick up stuff as you play through each run. These pickups will improve your abilities, but overall you're doing the same thing. Swing a sword with one hand, throw a dagger with the other. So how can a game that looks like dog diarrhea and have such basic gameplay mechanics be so fun? The answer is through lots of enemy variety. The game has a large amount of different enemies to kill, and more difficult enemies will challenge you as you go through each dungeon. The enemies not only look different, but they also attack differently. You have to handle them in different ways to add lots of variety. This makes the game really fun to play, even with a basic primary gameplay loop. Some examples of this would be the bats that fly at you. They're small, so they're hard to hit with ranged weapons, but they're very easy to kill with melee. They're not really a massive threat, but it's very easy to miss them, especially when you're in the heat of battle and take damage. You have some slime type blobs that appear throughout the entire game. They actually evolve as you progress. In early levels, they will just hop towards you, but later, they'll teleport around, making them very hard to hit and a pain in the arsehole. Some of them will fire out a ripple effect through the ground that you need to dodge. There are zombie types that walk slowly, but later levels they'll suddenly dash towards you where you either have to block or dodge the attack. You've got ranged enemies like plants that fire out projectiles that home in on you. The easiest way to deal with these is to deflect the projectiles with the sword, which will then go back and kill the enemy. You have some later on that fire out lasers, which you have to avoid. The best way to handle these is to try to rush them and kill them with a melee attack before the laser reaches you. There are some that fire out horizontal beams at you. You can dodge these or use cover whilst picking them off with a ranged attack. There's one boss in particular that I really enjoy. It's a giant magic book that teleports around and fires these rows of projectiles at you. You've got to constantly keep weaving around to avoid getting hit whilst trying to figure out where it will appear next. And sometimes you'll need to physically duck in real life to not get hit by projectiles. Having enemies attack in ways that require the player to change up the tactics adds so much to the gameplay that even something like Ancient Dungeon that's visually simple with an incredibly simple gameplay loop can become incredibly fun and addictive. Having to physically dodge projectiles is a great way to remind players that they can actually physically move their bodies and not just use the thumbstick. The best way to do this is to restrict where they can move side to side, and you can have enemies send out some sort of horizontal beam attack that can only be avoided by crouching. Hitting projectiles back towards the enemies with melee also feels very satisfying. Another way to give enemies variety, and also make them more involving for the player to fight, is through weak spots. You've got some simple stuff like in Half-Life Alyx, with the armoured head crabs that need to be shot underneath, but a really good non-VR game that uses this concept is the Horizon games. In Horizon Zero Dawn, you fight robot dinosaurs. Some of them are massive, towering above you, and Aloy only has a bow and arrow as her main weapon. If you just keep trying to fire arrows into them, then you'll have a hard time defeating these beasts. The best way to defeat them is through weak spots. You can analyse them with a scan, then look at the information on each robot to find out its weaknesses. Aloy can also craft a bunch of different arrows, like fire arrows and some called tear arrows, which will stick in and remove armour. The most basic enemies are the Watchers. These are small Velociraptor type robots with a weak spot in the eye. If you can get a precision shot with a regular arrow, you can take them out one shot. The Bellowbacks have got huge cargo containers on the back. A few hits on these with fire arrows will eventually cause a massive explosion, which causes a lot of damage, making them easier to kill. One of the hardest enemies in the game is a Thunderjaw. These are huge and have a lot of different weak spots. They can attack you at range with cannons, which if you knock off with some well-placed tear arrows, you can then pick up the cannons and use them against the enemy. The game's combat doesn't rely on lots of different weapons. It allows you to craft different ammo types, then it adds the variety through the enemies, with different ways for the player to defeat them using specific arrow types on weak spots. So to summarise this video, as a small developer, the key to making a fun VR game is to focus on a primary gameplay loop, then iterate on it by adding complexity through clever level design, varied weapon types, and diverse enemies that need to be handled in different ways. A strong focus on utilising VR and motion controls can help elevate your game and make it more fun to play, so consider how the player will react and interact in the 3D space during gameplay. A very simple concept that I thought about was to combine a bow and arrow with golf. Using a bow and arrow in VR is really fun because it's such a physical way to fire a weapon. Having a small target in a level that you have to hit will force the player to take the time to aim with precision. After each shot, wherever the arrow lands, they are then teleported to that new location, and this is where they take the next shot from. The objective of the game is to hit the target with as few shots as possible. The gameplay loop is simple, but each course will be themed differently, with one in a forest setting with trees that you have to thread the arrow through. You could have one which is in a mountain where you have wind to deal with and compensate for, and another which could be on a space station with sections in zero gravity, affecting how the arrows fly and how fast they drop off. This would be a good example of taking a fun and simple gameplay mechanic of shooting arrows with a bow, and finding ways through clever level design to add new gameplay elements to give variety and keep things interesting. The last thing I'll mention is a little advert for myself. I've recently been offering a consultation service where developers can pay me, playtest the games, and I will give critical feedback on all parts of the game and game design to help them improve what they have and suggestions on things that they could add in the future. If you're a VR developer and this sounds like something you might be interested in, you can contact me through my email in the description or sign up for my developer tier on Patreon. I also want to give a huge thanks to my patrons and YouTube supporters who've really helped me out over this past year, and they've really made a difference.